Hello and welcome to another episode of Trash to Track. In this episode we're going to look at yet another one of Will's locos that was sent to me, and this one appears to be a mint boxed Great Western County class loco by Hornby, which again I think Will's won from an auction site. So looking into the box, it does appear to be brand new. The date on the service sheet there gives the 12th of March 1999. And the model and box and contents seem to be in very good, if not near mint condition. So disregarding the paperwork there, and there's yet more paperwork there, we come across the loco laying in its box, and like I said, it looks to be in absolute mint condition. I'm not sure if this model has ever been used in the past. The unopened detail pack is laying in the bottom of the polystyrene tray there. So I've removed the tender, now I remove the loco, and then it becomes apparent with the front pony truck that screw there is very loose, so somebody has had a go at this in the past. So I'm going to start by looking at the tender. The tender wheels are a little bit grubby, but not overly as such, and I was told by Wills that this was a non-running loco. So I put that loose front pony truck on the track there, and then I give it the battery test, and it is trying to run, although again very slowly. There's not much life in this model whatsoever. This is an early loco drive model from Hornby based on the Airfix tooling, so this model has its roots way back in the 1980s. I am surprised that this model isn't running, but this front pony truck here is concerning me. It is really loose, and I'm not even sure this is the correct screw that holds it in place, so I'm just going to try and tighten it up a little bit there. But instead I actually loosen it a bit more and I attempt to remove it, but the screw appears to be stuck. So I put the battery direct to the wheels, and as like I said, it's trying to run, but something on the inside is preventing it from doing so. So we're going to have to crack this open and have a look at what's going on at this seemingly newish model. To remove the model from its chassis, the body from its chassis, first I got that screw out that released the front pony truck at last, and you have to remove that screw there that keeps that brass keeper down, and also a screw underneath the cab, which the tender drawbar is also connected to. Once these are both removed, you can remove the chassis from the body shell. I didn't realise there that this screw had to come out. So like I said, once this screw's coming out, I'm going to get my act together. I just undo it there. And the screws on this model seem to be a bit over torqued. They've threaded themselves in the plastic a little bit, which will make reassembly later on quite hard. And it immediately becomes apparent that this isn't a new model, and it has been opened before, as there's extra lead been added to the rear of the boiler there. But the motor itself seems to be good, and there's that weight has also been modified and it's been cut down. Being not familiar with these models, I don't know if that's a genuine weight for this, but you can see the lead there. Putting the wires onto the motor, and again it's still a very poor runner. So I'm going to have to open up the motor and strip it down completely to see what's going on. Now, holding the brush plate in place, I'm just going to remove this retaining screw to remove the brush and the spring assembly. What I should have done, and what I would recommend doing, is to drop the wheel set out. I thought I could remove the motor without doing so, but it's not possible on this sort of chassis. So you will see in a minute that I have to remove the wheels to gain access to the motor completely. But removing this brush retainer and this wiring, well, I guess it's a wiring loom as such, the screws seem to be threaded in the plastic. This model has definitely been apart before, and whoever put it back together has not stuck to the don't over tighten your screws, as this one the screws have been over tightened and it has damaged the plastic housing a bit. So now that's removed, I can just pull out the brush spring there, but the brush itself appears to be stuck in the holder. And like I said, here I am removing the chassis and the wheels so that I can get the motor out of the motor faceplate out, and it actually falls out backwards, and it immediately becomes apparent what's wrong with this model. Look at the commutator faceplate on that. It is absolutely caked in oil. I have never in 20 years of repairing models seen a commutator that is as dirty and as oily as this one. The brushes were actually stuck to the commutator. I had to pull them off with these tweezer nose pliers. I've taken the armature out of the magnetic housing there, which I know a lot of people say not to do, but this really did need a thorough clean. So getting my usual cotton bud and methylated spirits, I removed most of the dirt off this commutator. I mean, look at that. It is horrible. It's absolutely caked in it. And what's worse is the oil has started to thicken. So it's no wonder that this model wouldn't turn over properly. So working away gently on the commutator there, first I remove it all that I can with a cotton bud and meths, and then I polish up the commutator faceplate with a fiberglass pencil. Polish it up again with another cotton bud and methylated spirits, and then ensure with a cocktail stick that the gaps in between the commutator brasses is absolutely clean and clear of all that carbon and oil buildup. From here on in, it only gets worse. Every part of this model now that I touch is absolutely caked in oil on the inside. The motor was particularly bad, but because this was mixed up with carbon deposits from the brushes. But as you'll see shortly when I take the chassis base plate off and the pickup part, that was swimming in oil as well. It was just unbelievable, and this model really does prove why you shouldn't over oil your models. You can see the oil on this chassis base plate glistening. And another thing that made it worse was I could tell by the smell of this that this was 3-in-1 oil that had been bought from a car shop or a supermarket and is in nowhere near suitable for model oil. Use the correct lubrication on models. Don't just buy any old oil, as you will see from this model, it just ruins it. You can see the oil glistening now on this plate. It was everywhere, and it was a good hour and a half before I had actually removed all of it. I did give this a couple of blasts with the contact cleaner, and yet there was still more oil. Apologies for knocking the camera stand there, but there was still more oil to be found in all the crevices. I soaked the brushes in carbon cleaner overnight as well, just to remove the oil that had soaked into them. No wonder this county class didn't run very well. It might have well have been chucked in an oil bath. I don't think there was this much oil come out of when they last did an oil change on my Ford Focus. But we're getting there now, and after the use of about 50 or 60 cotton buds, I've now cleaned the chassis and the motor up. But like I said, every time I move something there seemed to be more oil appear. So here I am cleaning the pickups again, and you can see the yellow oil on the end of that cotton bud. And I'd already cleaned this once and left it overnight, and then once you move it in between the gaps on the brasses and the plastic, there was just more oil seeping out. So now that I've cleaned all this up, I eventually turned my attention to the wheels and axles, and these were given a thorough cleaning as well with the cotton bud and methylated spirits. And I've just kept this time-lapsed sequence in here so you can see just how long I took to clean this model up. But like I said, I'm going to do the axles and the wheel backs now, and you can see that the sheer amount of oil on this, it was just ridiculous. I know I keep saying it, but don't lubricate your models with the wrong sort of lubrication. So now I've removed all the lubrication, I'm just going to give the interior of the magnet there a clean, as this again was very oily. The oil had splattered everywhere, and you will see shortly when I reassemble the model why I think the oil got everywhere. This is a very badly designed motor by Airfix or Hornby, because the actual drive cog on this model is right in front of the commutator faceplate. So any lubrication you put on it is going to run round on that cog and get splashed onto the commutator. So when I reassemble this model, I actually don't lubricate some of the drivetrain, which is a first for me. I've never actually done that before, as I do believe that models need to be well lubricated with the correct lubricant before you reassemble them. But if I'd have put oil on that cog, it would have just splattered on the commutator and would have been back to square one. So I put the wheels back in the chassis there, put the pickup plate back on, and then I'm going to rebuild the motor. I mean, this was quite fiddly in itself, trying to get all these pickups lined up. And again, every time I moved something, I found yet more and more oil. But once it was removed, I actually put some of this ultralight conductive lubricant on the axles there, as they were now completely dry, having been cleaned to within an inch of their life. I put the pickup plate back in, and then ensure that all the brass pickups are pressing on the wheel backs correctly as they should. Now I'm going to rebuild the motor, first by putting the magnetic field and magnet coil back in. The rear motor housing is then pushed on. I then turn the motor block over and reinsert the armature, and there goes the armature, and you can see there at the front, right in front of the commutator, is one of the drive cogs. That is a really poor design, and I've never actually come across a motor with the drive cog directly on the armature like that, so that any lubrication, like I said, goes onto the commutator. The main drive cog there is, like I said, put on the front of the motor, and then it's held in place with this long screw, and then the motor front plate goes on. This was held in place with its screws, but you can only screw this on after you've reinserted the brushes and the springs, and as the brushes and springs are held in place with metal parts that are also held in place with the motor retaining screws. So now that that's all been reinserted, you actually have to remove that motor keeper plate there to screw this screw in. I thought the screw went through the motor keeper plate, and it actually sits underneath it. I just think this motor is very poorly designed, and it's the same sort of motor that's in the early Hornby Castle class, including the Hogwarts Castle that we looked at way back in episode 3, I think it was, of Trash to Track. But now the cogs are screwed back in, the motor front plate's back on, the brushes and springs were put back on, and I engage it back into the drivetrain there, just lining it up with the cog on the centre wheel, and then it was refixed back to the chassis. When I can get the screwdriver to line up with the screw, I will screw that back onto the chassis, like I said, and the screw at the rear of the motor under the cab actually holds a wire in place on a metal washer. So this wiring loom, if you can call it that, was then bent back round to the front, and I will show you in a second when I put this bit of wire back on. I'll show you in a second just how dirty these brushes were. I try not to over tighten the screws on this model, but it was very difficult, as like I said, they'd been tightened to within an inch of their life, and most of the plastic had already been threaded. So you can see there that even after soaking these brushes, there is still a lot of crap on them, and you can see it all coming off of my fingers there. They really were dirty, but I did give them a good clean up, and they were reusable after about a day's cleaning, and that included probably 20 hours soaking in contact cleaner. So the brushes were put back into the motor like that, followed by the springs, and then the brush retaining parts were screwed back in, as were the motor retaining screws. You'll see that when I replace these brush retainers, that when I put these small silver screws back in, they just wouldn't tighten up. There was not really a lot I could do with this, short of putting some super glue or something on these screws, but then that would hamper any further maintenance or servicing this model may need in the future. So once the brushes and springs were put back in, I get the wires off the battery, put them on there on the motor, and just look how much freer that motor spins with those drive wheels, whereas before it wouldn't move at all. Now the motor's been rebuilt and the wheels are back in, I'm going to re-thread the piston rods onto the cylinder slide bars and put the slit cylinders back onto the chassis block. And then we're coming to the end of this oily and dirty rebuild. Putting the cylinders back on was quite fiddly, as you'd get one side in and the other would fall out. But doing a quick battery test there reveals that the model is now running quite nicely on wheel pickup alone, whereas before it wouldn't run at all. So what I'm just doing now is I'm getting some insulation tape just to wrap the motor in, as at this point I'd already attempted to put the chassis back into the body shell, but the wire was pushing on the metal motor casing and shorting it out. But now I've insulated it, I'm going to re-engage the chassis clip at the front and then re-secure these screws in place And in fact I did use a tiny amount of glue on the front screw here, as this just wouldn't tighten. It was basically in a hole that was too big for the screw. It had been over tightened, and the thread had been stripped off the screw mounting. Just give it a test there to make sure there's no short circuits. The tender drawbar was put back in place, the spring was replaced, and then the small screw at the back was then tightened up. And again, unfortunately, I had to use a small amount of Loctite, as the plastic parts had been threaded with somebody over tightening these screws in the past. The last thing to go on was the front pony wheel, and this was held in place with one of the screws that held the chassis base plate on. Just make sure that pony truck's going in the right way, as I wouldn't want to put it in upside down, as I've done that in the past. And then, like I said, the final screw was put in the chassis base plate just to keep the front bogie in place. Now everything's back together, I'm going to use the battery to power the wheels and give the driving wheels a final polish up with the fiberglass pencil. Although by the look of the wheels turning, this battery is fast draining, so I'm going to have to invest in a new one. But once the driving wheels are polished with the fiberglass pencil, I then give them a final polishing up with a cotton bud soaked in methylated spirits, just to make sure that everything is clean. And I also give the wheel backs another polish, just in case there's any stray oil that's gone onto them. The front bogie wheels were also cleaned, as these had quite a bit of oxidisation on them. Again, using a fiberglass pencil, and then they were polished up with a cotton bud and meths, which is my usual go-to method with this sort of thing. So now, looking at the model, it's all back together. The body shell just needs a bit of a dust up with an old paintbrush, and then I'm pleased with how this rebuild has now ended. And like I said, this was one of the dirtiest, oiliest models I've ever worked on. A battery test now on the test track, and you can see that it's actually quite a nice runner. Now it's all back as it should be, although I am concerned that the screws are all threaded in this, and it probably won't take many more services before this model is reduced to a parts bin only. It will need a new motor at least, if it's taken apart much more. The GWR County class I do like, and has been on my wants list for a very long time now. I'm working on this model, albeit with its pathetic little motor really, considering modern standards. I'm going to have to keep my eye out and buy one. So one of the last jobs is just to polish up the tender wheels, just to remove the oxidisation and crud that has accumulated over the few years it's been in storage, just to make sure that it's not spreading any dirt or anything onto the track when you run it round a layout. And that's this county rebuild all complete. It's gone from an oily mess into quite a nice looking model. Now that the wheels have all been cleaned and the model's been completely serviced, I've just turned it upside down now, just to test whether or not the tender actually picks up through that brass tender drawbar, and it appears that it picks up from one side only. As you can see there, it's picking up from those wheels, but it doesn't pick up from the left hand side if it was face down in direction of travel going forwards. It just picks up from the right hand side. It's a bit of a strange design flaw, as it appears to pick up from 6 wheels on one side but only 3 on the other. But there we go, that's the county all cleaned thoroughly and rebuilt, and I'm going to head upstairs now to James's DC layout and give it a run in. If you've got a loco you'd like to see featured on a future episode of Trash to Track, please email me at the email address shown on screen now. That's dansmodelrailways@gmail.com, and we'll have a look at getting it sent over, and who knows, it will be repaired and may even feature on a Trash to Track episode all of its own. Thanks for watching Trash to Track. Please like, share and subscribe, and I'll catch you in the next video. Bye for now.